Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. You can subscribe to the Undercurrents community over at undercurrents.tv. You get premium episodes over there and an opportunity to chat with us. So make sure to sign up if you're interested. Subscribe on YouTube and wherever you download your podcasts. Today's guest is Josh Hammer. So let's get to the news. Over the weekend, I want to focus on two headlines that have come out. First, BBC. Gaza ceasefire once again in doubt as first phase nears end. Another one, this one is from the New York Times. Expanding West Bank campaign. Israel sends tanks for first time in decades. Now, depending on what side of this conflict you are on, you say West Bank or you say Judea and Samaria. I'm sort of a realist on this. If you've paid attention to the show here, we've talked a lot with Dave Smith. We had my friend Ryan Grimm on the show. That's sort of where I come from. Today, though, we have Josh Hammer, and Josh is also considers himself a realist, but he's very, very supportive of Israel through the lens of what America's interest in the region is. And I thought it would be great to talk to Josh. He has a new book out that's called Israel and Civilization. The subheading is The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. So even just from that, you can sort of tell where he's coming from on this, but a lot of his perspective is shared by a lot of the country. Not all of the country, but a lot of the country. And he makes this case he makes this case with lots of details and history. And so I thought it would be worthwhile having a conversation, going back and forth a little bit with Josh on this question, as Donald Trump has been in office for a month and is taking a sledgehammer basically to the paradigm that has dominated American politics and actually the American foreign policy on Israel for decades. Trump is absolutely, so some people say outside the box. That's definitely an accurate description, but it's almost like he's rejecting the box itself when he talks about his peace plan for Gaza. When he talks about what the ultimate end goal for the region is, he just doesn't come to it with a lot of the preconceived, not just notions, but ideological commitments that Republican and Democratic politicians have for a long time. So there are people on the left that were at first very interested in Donald Trump's approach to Gaza. He secured the ceasefire. Steve Witkoff secured the ceasefire that upset a lot of people on the pro-Israel right. And then on the other hand, people on the left who may have been encouraged by that, encouraged by the way Donald Trump challenges Netanyahu in ways that American presidents, including Joe Biden, tend to shy away from, have been less encouraged by his idea for, in his words, quote, cleaning out Gaza, which sounds like you can say he just means the rubble, but it obviously sounds like a permanent cleaning of the people of Gaza out into different parts of the region, as Trump has said his plan is. And it's unclear whether he thinks that would be permanent or temporary, but it sounds to many people who are sensitive about that like it would be a permanent displacement of people who want to live in Gaza. Or who want to live in different parts of the region. So it was really good to have some perspective from a different voice that we haven't had a lot of on the show, frankly. So I had an interesting conversation with Josh. As all of this news is unfolding, as you have Donald Trump, this extremely unorthodox politician, being a huge part of the negotiations over hostage releases, over what's happening right now in the West Bank. So Josh Hammer, once again, has a new book out. It's called Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Very, very timely, and I'm excited for you to hear this conversation with Josh, where we talk about some of this news that developed over the weekend, and also Josh's sort of long-term perspective on the region in general, and on what's happened domestically as well. So without further ado, here's Josh Hammer. Want to optimize your metabolism? I found a powerful tool that helps, Lumen. Lumen is a handheld metabolic coach that measures your metabolism through your breath. The app shows if you're burning fat or carbs and provides personalized guidance on nutrition, workouts, and sleep. Just breathe into Lumen each morning. It reveals your metabolic state and gives you a tailored nutrition plan. Use it before and after workouts or meals for real-time insights into your body's fuel source. Your metabolism affects weight, energy, fitness, and sleep. Lumen helps optimize it. It even adapts to hormonal changes, helping manage energy and cravings over time. Take control of your metabolic health today. Visit lumen.me/undercurrents for 20% off. That's lumen.me/undercurrents for 20% off. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. Josh Hammer, author of Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and Destiny of the West. Thank you so much for being here.
Emily, my pleasure to be back with you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, everyone always says when someone has a book out, like, oh, timely topic, timely topic. You have chosen the topic, though, that is extremely timely right now because there are literal peace negotiations attempting to happen. They're underway. But I want to read a New York Times headline right now. This is from today. Expanding West Bank campaign. Israel sends tanks for first time in decades. And this is really interesting because I actually think it gets to the question at the center of your book about the future of Israel as Israel wants to sort of determine itself and its borders. Can you just give us a reaction to what we're seeing happen in the West Bank?
Sure. Well, there's been Iranian proxy terrorist organizations operating throughout Judea and Samaria, what the mainstream media likes to refer to as the so-called West Bank. I mean, this has been a long-standing problem for forever. I mean, one of the original sins of everything that's going on in Judea and Samaria was the Oslo Accords going back to the 1990s, and Mahmoud Abbas, who has run the Palestinian Authority since 2005. Emily, as you probably know, he was supposed to be available for a 4-year term back in 2005. Here we are 20 years later. There have not been elections. So everything in the Palestinian Authority is deeply corrupt. It is deeply tied to terror. And the purported authorities do nothing whatsoever to tamp down on radical Islamic terrorism. So in hotbeds such as Nablus, such as Jenin there, you do have Hamas, Gaza-like terrorist threats that not only are emerging, but indeed have emerged there. So this has been one of the most volatile areas in the region for the past few years there. I'm hardly surprised that the IDF has seen it necessary to start sending in troops. This is one of the underappreciated and underdiscussed stories, frankly, over the past year and a half, 2 years or so, is just the number of sheer terrorist attacks actually there in Judea and Samaria itself. It's really not just Gaza. Gaza gets a lot of the headlines there, but the situation in Judea and Samaria is completely unstable, and I think the whole region is at a crossroads as to what should happen to that particular region. We happen to have a president of the United States who is thinking very outside the box and outside of so-called two-state solution paradigms when it comes to the future. And I'm hoping, Emily, that my book will be a timely piece of the puzzle here as well.
So when you say that area is at a crossroads, I'm curious what you think the future could look like, and maybe even your argument for what it should look like. I mean, obviously, I don't think anyone says it's easy, but what could happen in the days to come, especially when you look at Netanyahu having a fairly strong ally in Donald Trump, who, to your point, is thinking outside of the box. He's not he's definitely not like tied into the restrictions that most Republicans or Democrats have often seen. He's willing to kind of talk beyond the paradigm. So what could happen in the months, potentially years to come? What should happen there, Josh?
So I think before we talk about what should happen, we probably should talk about what the actual state of things legally and politically is in Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank. So there is a tragic amount of complete misinformation on this topic, maybe above all, Emily. I suspect if you ask even conservatives, even most conservatives, whether or not there is an illegal, quote unquote, occupation in the quote unquote West Bank, I suspect that you would have the overwhelming majority of people tell you just resoundingly, oh, yeah, of course, the answer is yes there. But actually, if you go back and look at the history and international law, it's actually quite a bit more complicated than that there. So the actual origins of the carving up of the modern Middle East map, the states of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, contemporary Jordan, what came to be contemporary Israel. It all goes back, Emily, to the post-World War I dispensation. This is when you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement, led by the Brits, led by the French there. This was kind of the initial carving up of the Middle East map. And back under the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the Nine Nations there, you had the Brits control what was referred to as the British Mandate for Palestine. And under the British Mandate for Palestine, that was subsequently divided itself into two then entities below that. You had mandatory Palestine, and then you had the Mandate for Transjordan. The latter became the modern day country of Jordan. The former, mandatory Palestine, was the original Jewish state in this original two-state solution that the European powers carved up after World War I. The key point here for our purposes is that mandatory Palestine, the actual Jewish state component here under international law and under the actual literal dividing up of the map, actually included all of Gaza and all of Judea and Samaria, because again, it was actually the Mandate for Transjordan that quite literally was supposed to be what we would now refer to as the so-called Palestinian state. So you can fast forward then 18 years. That was all in 1920, the San Remo conference in Italy there. Fast forward 18 years to May of 1948, when David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, declares independence. The key point for international law, and again, Ben-Gurion's Independence Declaration was ratified by Harry Truman, famously was the first international leader to recognize this 11 years later. The key point is that under international law, there's a principle called uti possidetis juris, which basically means that when there is a part of the world and there is a new state or states that form, the operating assumption, unless there was some extraordinarily compelling reason to the contrary, is that those new independent states inherit the border of the previous sovereign entity in that part of the world. So at the time of 1948, Israel actually inherited Gaza and Judea and Samaria. By the way, this international law principle doesn't just apply obviously to Middle East. It's a universal principle of international law. We saw the exact same thing in Eastern Europe after the fall of Yugoslavia. We've seen it in countless situations in Africa as well. So what happened was after Israel declares independence in 1948, then you have a series of Arab armies that invade on all sides, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and so forth there. And there's a series then of armistice lines, of temporary ceasefire lines that are essentially reached over the course of the next year from late 1948 to early 1949. But those were never permanent lines. They were simply just armistice lines with the understanding that there would then be a future long-term settlement. That permanent settlement, tragically, has never come. So contrary to those who are shrieking that there is some sort of nefarious occupation in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank there, under international law, there actually is no such thing. In fact, under international law, Israel has the best claim there. Now, again, reasonable minds can differ as to what the best political solution is, but it's quite literally true that under the original terms of the League of Nations, the actual so-called Palestinian state in the so-called two-state solution was supposed to be Jordan. And to this day, the country of Jordan, which is led by an ethnic minority Hashemite monarch, King Hussein, it's actually roughly a 70% Palestinian country there. So even to this day, the ethnics and demographics in that particular country actually bear out that original dispensation. So as far as the actual what the political solution should be, with that in mind, Emily, I think we have to look at the following thing. Sure. The United States, like pretty much all Western powers, been obsessed for 60, 70 years now with this idea of land for peace and just giving away ever increasingly large slivers of land in this already terribly small part of the world for the sake of peace. First of all, that's been a demonstrable failure because the results of so-called land for peace in many ways got us October 7th in the first place there. In fact, Gaza really was, I think, a miniature two-state solution experiment from 2005 until the year 2023. We all saw exactly what a so-called two-state solution looks like. A so-called two-state solution looks like Holocaust survivors being executed execution style in their kitchen, babies being put in ovens, and so on there. The relevant question, though, Emily, because I'm a nationalist, I'm a realist, I am a very sober thinker when it comes to foreign policy. I don't get emotions involved at all. The relevant question is, what is actually in the U.S. national interest? That is what I think every American who is watching this program ought to be thinking about there. And the relevant question, I think, has an extraordinarily easy answer. There is zero, literally zero American national interest served in carving up yet another Arab state in that part of the world. There are dozens. There are dozens of Arab states. There are 40, 50, 60 Muslim majority states there. From an American national interest, if you prioritize stability in the Middle East, if you prioritize the free flow of oil, for instance, throughout the Red Sea, where these Houthi pirates not blowing up cargo ships there, you want to embolden our allies in the region who actually share our national interest. That means emboldening Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, countries like that there. There is no interest whatsoever served in creating a brand new Iranian satrapy, which is immediately what a so-called new country of Palestine in Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, would be there. So I think that there's actually a pretty clear answer here. Admittedly, it's thinking outside the box, but again, I'm fortunate. I think that we're very fortunate to have in Donald Trump a commander in chief who's doing precisely that.
Well, yeah, so this is where you're really interesting because a lot of people who would agree with everything that you just laid out on the first part about the legal claim to different pieces of land would depart with you when you say that there's literally no American interest that's served by carving up another slice of this region. And I'm really wondering, Josh, what response you get, because right now it's such an interesting moment on the right with realism ascendant and with Donald Trump talking about this wild idea for Gaza. But is there even maybe a marriage between what he talks about with Gaza and how he could handle the situation in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria? How do you see that?
I hope that there is. I hope that his view for Gaza ultimately prevails in Judea and Samaria as well. You probably don't even need to get into the question of population transfer, which Donald Trump has. It's crazy that we're even having this conversation. This was a taboo subject, even in the most right wing pockets, of U.S. Israel advocacy, and Donald Trump has somehow kind of made this topic great again, I guess, for lack of a better way.
He
So
literally used the word clean. Yeah, he said we need to
yeah,
clean it up.
yeah. I mean, good for him for truly being quite that outside the box a thinker there. So I certainly have no objection if he wants to kind of take that same approach to Judea and Samaria there. But I don't think you actually have to either. Israel could simply apply sovereignty. It simply could actually apply its sovereignty to the territories that it already legally has the best claim under international law to there too. And again, Emily, the question is, you have Iranian funded proxy militias like Lion's Den, you have Hamas that are active in Judea and Samaria. What is the American national interest that is served from giving Hamasistan a brand new state there in Nablus, in Jenin? There is none. There is none whatsoever. The only compelling interest. The only interest that America has in the Middle East in general, Emily, are containing radical Islam. Back in the day, you had the neocons say we fight them there so that they don't come here. That's not the right way to view this. The right way to view this is two things. One is you have a very tight immigration policy. The 9/11 Commission famously in 2004, 2005 recommended, among other things, biometric visas. Now we have to have the ability to trap people who come in here who cannot overextend their visas because most of the 9/11 hijackers were on those visas. So we haven't done that. So we failed there. But when it comes to the actual Middle East itself, again, I continue to believe that the best way to go about this is not to have America try to start blowing up infinite jihadis. We can, in very limited situations, the Qasem Soleimani strike at the Baghdad airport in 2020 would be a good example. That guy had a tremendous amount of American blood on his hands from those roadside IEDs during the Iraq War and the counterinsurgency. But the better mid to long-term way to do this is to embolden our allies to patrol their own areas so that we can strategically retrench from the Middle East in order to focus on America's actual 21st century civilizational threat, which is the Chinese Communist Party. All of this actually, Emily, is in service of what I consider to be the necessary broader Indo-Pacific foreign policy realignment there. The Abraham Accords foreign policy, I view as actually a China-centric foreign policy, maybe somewhat counterintuitively, because what you're actually doing there is in emboldening our allies to make common cause in this Iran containment alliance that allows them to better kind of patrol against Iran and Hezbollah, the Houthis, all the various tentacles of the Iranian regime. What you're doing is you're actually then passing off the baton to these allies there so that you can better focus on your own actual threat, which namely is China in the Far East there. They wouldn't have sold it like that, but that basically is what the Abraham Accords was. How did you get the Abraham Accords, Emily? By doing this whole two-state solution, land for peace thing, trying to give away Nablus or Jenin to Hamas? No. No. The only way that you got these transformative generational peace deals, bringing the UAE, Bahrain, and so forth to the table there to make peace with Israel, was by emboldening Israel and by convincing the Arab states that America has Israel's back because we share the same national interest, national security interest in the region there. So it all makes sense if you think about it there. But again, emotions so often kind of rise to the forefront of this debate there, and I think it clouds sober and reasoned judgment.
Well, and this is maybe where you and I depart, because even from a realist perspective, I look at so Hamas, for example, cites the Abraham Accords, whether we believe them or not, but they cite the Abraham Accords as one of the reasons, one of the impetus for, or part of the impetus for October 7th, because they felt isolated, cut out of the process, and all of that. So as a Hamas or as an Iranian proxy, you look at Hamas and you look at the Abraham Accords, and I guess my question is, what should happen to the people, be they in, Gaza, another part of the region? What should happen to the people, and how do people, who want to support the Jewish state deal with that without, I guess, inflaming tensions? You use the word infinite jihadis, and that's, to me, very accurate. Like, from a realist perspective, infinite jihadis is a problem that I don't know that gets better with Trump's Gaza plan. So I guess, Josh, I'm curious how you think about that.
So I don't know why we're purporting to care about what Hamas says. Hamas is an organization that literally has a founding charter. It's available to this day from the Yale Law School website. You can read it. It calls for the death of every Jew across the world. They don't have particularly nice things to say about Christians and other so-called infidels either. This is an organization, Hamas, that was founded as the Muslim Brotherhood affiliate in Gaza. This is an organization that lobbed indiscriminately tens and tens of thousands of rockets, trying to slaughter as many civilians as possible there. October 7th was simply the apotheosis of all that they planned to do for a very long time. I mean, while we're in the business of purporting to care about what Hamas cares about, I suppose the next thing would be to start caring about what Osama bin Laden wrote about in his letters either there. I mean, I categorically reject the idea that we should take these people and their words even remotely seriously there. Furthermore, looking at the actual population in Gaza there, we actually have polling on this. And we actually know the extent to which the Palestinian people in Gaza, the exact same people that had been rapturously applauding as they had paraded the coffins of little babies throughout the streets of Gaza, the exact same people that we saw on October 7th who were passing out sweets as they were parading around the dead bodies of mutilated, savagely murdered, and mass gang raped women all throughout the city, all throughout the streets of Khan Yunis and Gaza City. We have polling on this. We know that the Al-Qassam brigades, the militant wing of Hamas, has an 86% approval rating in Gaza. We know that Hamas itself has roughly a 75 to 80% approval rating in Gaza. We know that Hezbollah has something like an 80% approval rating in Gaza. To say that this is a radicalized population, I think, would be something of a serious understatement there. And, once upon a time, the West understood that when you have a deeply radicalized population that is mass supporting a monstrously evil regime, and that regime commits terrible things there, then there's going to be collateral damage. And there's going to be collateral damage, as anyone who's ever looked at a map of Dresden or Berlin or the Doolittle raid over Tokyo during World War II can tell you there. At some point, as H.L. Mencken, the great 20th century newspaper columnist and literary and social critic, said there, democracy is the theory that the common man knows what he wants and he deserves to get it good and hard. Well, we actually had something remotely resembling quote unquote democracy in Gaza back in 2007. That's when Hamas was popularly elected by the people there. This is what they want. This is literally what they want. You look at polling, they say they want to try to kill Jews. You look at polling, and they say they have no interest whatsoever in recognizing Israel. So I'm sorry, but I simply do not care for this notion that we should care in any way what Hamas, which is a U.S. recognized foreign terrorist organization, says there. This is the most grotesque and insipid form of moral relativism. I think that we should just as soon be caring about what Osama bin Laden said in order to try to justify 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, from a realist perspective, so you would argue that they're not necessarily like rational actors, that they're like jihadi mentality or ideology doesn't mean that they should be dealt with as rational actors in like a geopolitical sense.
Their charter speaks for itself. I mean, like, their charter is not a rational statesman actors here. We're not dealing with Brezhnev and Khrushchev here. We're not dealing with cold calculating atheists in the Kremlin who you can map out a game theory econ 101 analysis with there. You're actually dealing with genocidal jihadis. We've seen this time and time again, who really do believe in the whole 72 virgins in heaven thing and glorifying themselves and martyring themselves for the glory of Allah and all of that there. How do I know that? Because they literally tell us. I mean, like, we actually have a lot of public polling on this.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that at all. So I guess then my last question on this before we dive into what you just alluded to, this question of moral relativism. My last question on that is to I guess it sounds like what you're saying is that you can't defeat that. It doesn't go away with an ideological clash. You can't convince people who support Hamas that there's a peaceful solution. Ultimately, it'll have to be dealt with force. Is that, I guess, is that sort of ultimately how you think that is resolved?
There's been one lingua franca, one common language of the Middle East since the founding of Islam in the 7th century, many centuries ago. And the lingua franca, the commonly understood language of the Middle East, is power. That is the only language that the Arab world understands. I mean, Saudi Arabia to this day has a sword in their national flag. And I'm not mocking the Saudis. I view the Saudis as actually a very important piece of the puzzle there in a generally Western aligned country under the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. I'm just saying that there is a way to exert power and to try to defeat an enemy in the Middle East, and that actually involves power, not necessarily diplomacy. Diplomacy is great insofar as it goes. Diplomacy should always be tried there, but at some point, power has to be the actual result of what at this point has been a century or more long jihad to slaughter the Jews of Israel. And by the way, this says another misnomer in this conflict is that this somehow has to do, on the one hand, they say, oh, it has to do with Judea and Samaria and the so-called occupation. Absolute nonsense, because you go back before 1967, which is when many people cite the fallacious so-called occupation too, there were still any number of terrorist attacks between 1948 and 1967. A lot of people say, oh, it has to do with 1948 and the founding of Israel. Total nonsense. There was a genuine massacre of the Jewish community of Hebron, the second holiest city in Judaism, in 1929. It's called the Hebron Massacre. 60 to 70 Jews were slaughtered there. There was a similar pogrom in Sfat in northern Israel back in the early 19th century. It has nothing to do with this. It has nothing to do with this whatsoever. It has exclusively to do with the fact that there is a revanchist mentality. There's actually a literal doctrine in Sharia thought that actually compels certain believers and proponents there to reconquer territories that were once under the Ummah, that were once under the broader caliphate, and then have subsequently been lost there. And because that part of the world, there was never, ever an independent so-called quote unquote state of Palestine, but that part of the world was ruled by, for example, the Ottomans for a few hundred years there. Because it was under nominally Muslim control there are many who believe that it must be reconquered violently if necessary.
So this brings us to this brings us home, really, because you write about in the book the twin threats of the Nietzschean right and the DEI left. And I think there are some students who have gotten unfairly treated, but I also think that they're fairly stunning examples, whether they're students or Antifa aligned groups that march around New York City who are truly aligned with Hamas, like openly aligned with Hamas and openly aligned with like jihadi violence and believe in that. So I'm curious, Josh, how you think the United States in 2025 sprouted these, as you say, twin threats of the Nietzschean right, which is maybe not something that you and I would have identified as a significant threat on our own side 10, 15 years ago. Or maybe I shouldn't speak for you, but maybe you would have. But sprouted such, I guess, potent examples of both right now.
So the Nietzschean right, as I refer to it in the book, I'm referring here, Emily. I mean, we all see it online. It's kind of a lot of the pseudo culture on social media. I talk in the book a little bit about BAP, Bronze Age pervert. There, a lot of this within the right, and I'm obviously a man of the right. A lot of this has to do with the fact that we for the longest time have never advanced moralistic argumentation. But I'm really talking here about domestic affairs, by the way. I'm not even talking about foreign affairs.
Sure.
We have not made moralistic argumentation. We have not made biblical arguments there. We frankly have not talked a whole lot about religion and the Bible really at all. A lot of this, Emily, you and I have both been involved with national conservatism over the past few years. A lot of this kind of goes back, in my estimation, to kind of the ruinous seeds of the formation of modern fusionism, which for decades going back to the 1960s has been kind of the intellectual backbone of the American right. But as Henry Olson, excuse me, of the Ethics and Public Policy Center put it in an essay a few years ago, under the original Fusionism from Frank Meyer and National Review and those guys back in the 1960s, virtue and the Bible and social conservatism in general there was oftentimes made to be the handmaid of the liberty group there, of the libertarians and those who prioritize a lot of this. So I think that social conservatives really just totally not only lost their way, but they basically just got crowded out of the conversation in general. And when you have that there, and then you have a nominal right of center that is being disproportionately run by libertarian adjacent forces there, well, there's going to be a vacuum. There's going to be a need for something to rise. So I think a lot of this then has been kind of this neo-pagan sentiment, frankly, in many ways. There, I mean, this infatuation, in some ways with bodybuilding. There, I'm not downplaying bodybuilding. If you want to go lift weights, there, good for you, I guess. There, but these are not necessarily the things that the Judeo-Christian biblical tradition prioritizes. There, so there's been a complete kind of just lack of priorities when it comes to that particular sliver there. And I do think that that is why some people on the right have increasingly marginally kind of gone off the rails when it comes to clear-eyed thinking about issues both foreign and domestic. And then the woke left is a slightly different phenomenon. That would take a whole nother podcast, I think, to kind of unpack there. Look, you mentioned the protests in New York City and all across the country there. You simply also cannot necessarily downplay enough, or you cannot, I think, overstate the toxic influence of mass migration. Mass migration has, at this point in America, over the past 60 years since the Hart-Sellers Act of 1965, I think that you would be hard pressed to say that it has been a net good. Maybe it would have been a net good at some point 20, 30 years ago there. But anyone who has spent any time in large pockets of urban America, certainly here in Miami and the South Florida area where I live there, if you want to go to Minneapolis, to Little Mogadishu, Dearborn, Michigan, we are simply just not doing a good job. We are not doing a good job of assimilating many of those who we have brought in there. And a lot of this goes back to the conceit of universal values, to this idea on both the neoliberal left and the neoconservative right, that human beings are simply widgets on an economics 101 chalkboard, and that they can be kind of swapped and brought in, and that they can be used for employers' interest, for corporate interest. It doesn't matter what God, or if they worship any God there, what city they face when they pray. I mean, people have just forgotten that these things actually matter there. And in many ways, tragically, we have actually brought to our shores part of the actual problem itself. The woke phenomenon, again, a more complicated phenomenon. I attribute a lot of that really to the rise of Barack Obama in 2008 and the whole notion of DEI, identity politics. The good news there, Emily, is that the American people are just emphatically rejecting that, because wokeism is in many ways just a rejection of the biblical worldview of Genesis 1:27. God made male and female, he created them. And I think in order to best combat all of these forces, Nietzscheanism, the woke left, and so forth, there, it really would be incumbent upon Jews and Christians alike to kind of rediscover their moral spine and their biblical inheritance there, and to team up in what I argue for in this book to be a grand alliance between Jews and Christians to ultimately defend the West against the three hegemonic threats that threaten to destroy us, which are in no particular order: wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism.
So just my last question is actually what you said, and you write about this in the book, on the left and the right. It does seem to be tied together by this idea that classical liberalism was itself neutral and not predicated on any values. And that's sort of how, on the left, you end up with a lot of, I guess, feminists in Europe right now reacting to their movement's embrace of or tolerance, maybe embrace is too strong of a word, for Islamism that ends up in mistreatment of women. And then on the right, you end up with, like you said, that vacuum being filled by sort of Nietzschean bros. I guess it's this idea that classical liberalism, or it seems like maybe it is this idea that classical liberalism, and the French kind of see it this way too, it says it's just neutral. It's just the most neutral system of values in the world.
Yeah, attempts at attaining a faux moral neutral, values neutral high ground here, there, and everywhere fail. I mean, if I could put that in a bumper sticker, I would put it on a bumper sticker. I mean, Emily, you and I, we used to co-host a podcast. I mean, we go way back. I mean, that what I just said is one of my sine qua nons. It's just, to me, it's so obvious that if you try to take this attempt and just say that we actually stand for nothing, let the chips fall where they may, the people are not going to react to that. because no one who's sitting in any country throughout the world there is going to be content with chips fall where they may. People want to believe in something. People inherently, as humans, as moral creatures, we do believe in things. We do have inclinations, proclivities towards belief, towards what Aristotle would have called a telos. We want to actually substantively achieve something over the mid to long there. We want a just regime. We want good governance. We want ultimately here in the West in America, we want a nation under God, indivisible, and so forth and so forth there. So, this attempt to say that we actually don't really stand for anything, your only creative vacuum, you're only necessarily creating the breeding ground for forces both benevolent and malevolent to ultimately sprout up there. But again, the onus, I think, for those of us who want to save the West, which by definition means starting with the United States, because the United States remains the indispensable cog of the West, if you actually want to start pushing back against the tide there, you have to assert something. The only question is, what is that something? I argue in Israel and civilization that something is the Bible. It is our biblical inheritance there, something that Jews and Christians share alike there, and only with Jews and Christians both trying to reclaim that inheritance and then trying to use that to then kind of latch onto that inheritance as kind of a firm undergird and a latching off point from which to start to rebut wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism, the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, that whole crew there. Only from that starting place of the Bible and biblical values can we have any hope, I think, of being successful. It's definitely not going to come from classical liberalism.
Josh Hammer, the amount of ground that we just covered in 30 minutes is insane. Thank you so much for joining the show.
My pleasure, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's edition of Undercurrents. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv, you can join the Undercurrents community. It's just $1 for your first month. I said before the episode that it was good to have Josh on, because we talked a lot with like Dave Smith and people like Ryan Grimm, and had them on the show. And I don't fully agree with those guys either. I sort of find myself as a conservative in the middle on this question. But it was good to have Josh here, because Josh is able to articulate a perspective with so much historical insight, legal insight as well, that is reflective of where a lot of people are on this issue. A lot of people in the presidential administration are on this issue. So to go back and forth with him a bit, I found really, really interesting. And I appreciate you for watching and for always being willing here on Undercurrents to not follow the herd, as we say at Unheard, and to just sort of have these conversations and be willing to think really deeply about what they mean. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for subscribing. We'll be back here with more Undercurrents soon.